Welcome, Bruchim Habaim, guests from abroad, and everybody that came tonight. I'm very happy as for many reasons, the Van Leer family and everything that belongs to Van Leer is very close to our heart here at the Jewish Museum. And before introducing Gabriel Motzkin, who will give the real talk, I would like to tell you that, because we are, since this Saturday, a very successful organization in attracting visitors. That's why today it's a little bit less. But last Saturday we had in the 3 institutions we run 13,000 people. Now that's easy, museum night, a new museum in the neighborhood, but still it's a big thing. One of the places we recently opened during the Museumnacht is the Hollandse Schouwburg. And one of the institutions we opened 5 years ago is the Portuguese synagogue. The Portuguese synagogue is now almost ready after a renovation process. You are sitting in an auditorium which was partly donated by the Van Leer Group Foundation. And you are next to a children's museum, which is also due to you. So I should tell you many thanks. The Portuguese synagogue almost ready. The Queen will come on December 20th. I'm not allowed to say that, but to this small group with so much security, I can do it. And the Hollandse Schouwburg is still far away, but we are in the middle of a feasibility study. And that's where there is a little connection, but very important, with Van Leer. As after the war, people in Amsterdam wanted to run the Hollandse Schouwburg as a theater again. And a group of Jews, under the late Jacob Soetendorp, Sam de Wolf, and Bernard van Leer, thought that this would not happen. And they bought the building. And I'm almost sure that there was a big part of Van Leer in it. Gave it to the city of Amsterdam to never be a theater again. And now that we want to enlarge it, we enjoy this act of the late Bernard van Leer. So it is a pleasure for me to introduce Gabriel Motzkin, whom I know from Jerusalem, who was Dean of the Faculty of Humanities at the Hebrew University. He's a historian and a philosopher. And since 3 years, he directs the Van Leer Institute in Jerusalem, which I personally love. And I'm happy that we do have a connection. Gabi, the floor is yours.
Thank you all. It's a particular pleasure to be in a place which I think embodies some of the best things of what one can call post-war diaspora Jewish culture. Now, it is not obvious that such a culture as post-war diaspora Jewish culture would exist anywhere in Europe. And I think that in the last 15 years, we have seen a renaissance of this culture, something which for me, as an Israeli, is a cause for ambivalence, because what do we share in common with this diaspora culture is a question which we have to pose ourselves. But not only us. Among the people who posed this question of the connection between the two is the Van Leer family, and therefore I would like to speak tonight on the subject of the Van Leer family, philanthropy, and Jewish identity, because their philanthropy was linked very much to their considerations of their own identity. And I will try to embed this in a general context, what I'm going to say to you, so that you understand how the Van Leers reacted to issues that faced most European Jews of their generation. I'm going to begin to read now. Most Jewish families in the last century and a half have moved uneasily between 3 notions of how to exist in the world, and the Van Leer family was no exception. These options were remaining within traditional religion, even if that traditional religion itself changed in relation to its circumstances, assimilation, which meant different things in different countries and cultures, and Zionism, which meant for most the creation of a Jewish national state in Palestine. There were other movements, such as autonomism, which sought to create an autonomous Jewish quasi-state in Europe, and Jewish socialism. But the average Jewish bourgeois family, especially in Western Europe, had to choose some mix of tradition, assimilation, and a redefined group identity. The least well-defined of these options is the middle one, that is, assimilation. Most contemporary Jews are assimilated to either a universal or a local non-Jewish culture in one sense or another. Zionists, for example, believe in modern science, and most bourgeois Jews enjoy art and music. Assimilation can mean anything from cultural assimilation to losing one's Jewish identity. Like many diaspora Jews in the past century and a half, the Van Leers were culturally assimilated, but they were proud of their Jewish identity. In no sense was either Bernard Van Leer, the man who made the fortune, or Oscar Van Leer, the man who structured the charity, traditionally religious. But at every opportunity, they demonstrated their solidarity with the Jewish people and its fate and future. However, there is also a relevant ambiguity contained in the term Zionism. David Ben-Gurion captured it well when he claimed that he recognized as true Zionists only those who decide to live in the land of Israel. Can you still be a Zionist if you don't live in Israel? The answer to this question is historically confusing, because not living in the Jewish national land meant something different before 1948, i.e. when there was no state, and after 1948, i.e. after the state existed. Before 1948, it is not clear that a majority of Jews were Zionists or even desired the creation of a Jewish national state. Since 1948, most Jews have been pro-Israeli, even if they are not actively involved with the Zionist movement as such. I do not see how you can be pro-Zionist without being pro-Israel, but I can imagine how one can be for Israel without being a Zionist. Thus, in our contemporary world, Zionism is a subset of the support for Israel. Unlike the pre-state situation, in which the support for a Jewish national state was a subset of the support for a Jewish national home. Even at the moment of 1948, an unquestioned Zionist such as Moshe Sharet, in contrast to Ben-Gurion, was not sure that the state should be declared. But there is another history intertwined with the modern history of Jewish nationalism, which is the history that is signified by the Holocaust, which has no direct connection with the Zionist enterprise, but which had a great impact on its fortunes. For the Van Leers, as for most Jews, World War II and the Holocaust were turning points. Before the war, Bernard Van Leer was optimistic about the prospects for the Jews in the Netherlands. He believed in the future fruitful existence of a diasporic Dutch Jewish community. But 80 to 90% of the Dutch Jewish community that he had known, and to whose welfare and culture he had contributed financially, was murdered in World War II. He and his direct family survived, but they had had to flee to the United States, where their situation was somewhat precarious for several years. For haute bourgeois families like the Van Leers, the automatic optimism that had fueled the Jewish encounter with modernity, the reciprocal promises of emancipation on the part of the European states and modernization on the part of the Jews, did not seem such an attractive offer after World War II. For Western European Jews, it seemed as if the quest for assimilation had led to the reality of annihilation. So the Zionists had been right after all. Pessimism about future existence in Europe turned into hopes for a new beginning elsewhere. To say that Bernard Van Leer, like many others, learned that he was a Jew in World War II is true, but it obscures the matter. In a sense, he was even more Jewish before the war than after the war. Like his wife, Polly, Bernard Van Leer grew up in a religiously Jewish home and he never denied his close ties to the Jewish community. Before leaving the Netherlands in 1941 for the United States, he made a conscious decision to donate a large amount of money to the cultural activities of the remaining Jewish community in Amsterdam. But it is true that his sense of what it means to be a Jew changed as a result of his wartime experience. The terms of his existence had to be renegotiated after the war. After the war, being Jewish was what made it possible for him to continue in his business. He was only able to regain his factories because of his eventually recognized claim that his sale of them to the Germans had been a forced sale because he was a Jew. In other words, he regained his wealth only on the basis of his being Jewish. But it should be noticed that the way he and the Dutch courts used the term Jewish after the war was different from the way they thought about the term Jewish before the war. After the war, being Jewish was viewed, even in a legal case such as Bernard van Leer's, as an ethnic definition and not as a religious definition. The crucial question for the Van Leers after World War II was whether or not to return to the Netherlands. In brief, they were undecided, since both returning to the Netherlands and leaving the Netherlands were steps which they took with great ambivalence. Bernard van Leer did return, although he often threatened the Dutch authorities that he would remove the headquarters of his company to another venue should they not show understanding of his needs. While he could entertain at different times Switzerland and the United Kingdom as possible sites for the transfer of the company, mandatory Palestine and then Israel were not feasible because the core of his business was manufacturing drums for the transport of petroleum, and many petroleum-rich countries did not view the national Jewish enterprise with favor. In contrast, his wife Polly van Leer did not want to settle in a city such as Amsterdam, which she viewed, she said so, as one big cemetery for Jews. She viewed the post-war Netherlands as an oppressive place for someone with a Jewish consciousness. Hence, she decided to move to Jerusalem already in 1947, i.e. before the State of Israel came into existence. She realized that settling in the Jewish community in Palestine was fraught with risk, but she had decided to devote her future to the spiritual well-being of the Jewish society in Palestine, Israel. Bernard and their older son Wim were also drawn in different ways to Israel. It was clear to Bernard that he would provide supplies and weapons for the struggle for the new state in 1948, whereas Wim eventually decided to settle in Israel as an entrepreneur. Both Polly and Wim were not ready to continue to exist as diasporic Jews in the Netherlands on the basis of old ideas about the meaning of Jewish identity. However, Polly did not, like so many other Jews, draw the conclusion that Jews should turn inward, that the unique should triumph over the universal, the particular over the general. On the contrary, she sought to understand the dilemmas of her time with universal criteria, and to this end she set up the Reuveni Foundation, which would be concerned with the interchange between her worldview and what she diagnosed as the problems of her time. Throughout her writings and her philanthropic activity, Polly believed in privileging spiritual improvement in contrast to material improvement. She never believed that an improvement in material conditions would of itself lead to spiritual improvement. But what kind of spiritual improvement? Where could there be a path which would lead to such a result? What are the constraints on spiritual improvement? In Polly's view, the pursuit of spiritual improvement must take cognizance of both the universal and the particular, of both our shared humanity and our particular identity. Polly thought that specifically the Jewish tradition contained both universal and particular elements, and that in the pursuit of spiritual improvement, both aspects should be highlighted. The only way to pursue this goal would be through a kind of philosophical meditation on the history of thought, in which one could take account of both the universal and the particular. Thus, the first task would be to inculcate an historical worldview. In that vein, Polly took up Vim's idea of publishing events of the past in a newspaper format. But the past that Polly sought to popularize was the particular biblical history of ancient Israel. And in tandem, she supported Keren Yaldenu, an organization that had been set up to impede Christian missionaries in Israel from combining religious mission and social work in poor neighborhoods in Israel. Jewish particularity required defense. Here again, spiritual well-being was more important to her than material well-being, Jewish consciousness more important than social work. Polly's biggest dream was to somehow combine an institute of adult education with a consecrated place where wise men, the thinker, the philosopher, the artist, and the scientist could discuss their thoughts with each other. Polly believed that the particular people of Israel have a universal mission, which she chose to locate in the Shema, you know, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one, thus emphasizing both uniqueness and universality. Correspondingly, once the Jews have succeeded in acquiring their material and political state, it becomes their obligation to live according to high values, for only such high values will ensure their survival in a Middle East in which they are surrounded by enemies who presumably do not esteem the Jewish fusion of universal and particular. This fusion of particularity and universality had implications for her epistemology, for her theory of knowledge. Like the Catholic historian of science, Duham, Polly believed that there exists no real contradiction between science and religion. However, that harmony between science and religion implies that God is not just transcendent, but also immanent in creation. As for Thomas Aquinas, science is the rational study of God's revelation. That's what she writes. Hence, science must be complemented by moral values, which are developed most fully, according to her, in the Jewish tradition. Hence, the integration that must be brought about is one between science and Judaism, and the only place in which this can occur fully is the State of Israel. The question arose of how to stimulate this encounter between science and a universal Judaism in a particular Israel. The practical outcome occurred in 1956 with the declaration of the intention of the Israeli government to establish an Israel Center for the Advancement of Human Culture. Polly got Bernard to commit $1 million of his own money to construct the building, and she would commit $500,000 of her own money, which originally came from him, to maintain the building. At that point, no other Van Leer Foundation existed, with one exception, the Bernard Van Leer Foundation in Lucerne, which served as the conduit through which the money was transferred. The point here is that the commitment to build what became the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute was actually Bernard's. Hence, Bernard Van Leer came to Israel for the inauguration ceremony. In his speech, Bernard made it clear that he viewed the project for this institute as a worthy recipient of the fruit of his life's labors. Polly, in turn, articulated her desire that in the projected building, the top personalities would come together for cooperative work in order to further the enlightenment of man. After Bernard Van Leer died, the unanimous decision of his family was that he should be buried in Israel. In part, this decision was reached for reasons that had to do with taxability and inheritance, but it also reflected the Israeli orientation of Bernard's widow and children. When Bernard died, his entire family was living in Israel. Managing the Van Leer business now fell to Oscar, who had to forego a managerial appointment at the Weizmann Institute in Rehovot, to which he had been looking forward in order to return to the Netherlands to run the business. Indeed, Oscar did want to live in Israel. When his father died, he was less than keen to return to the Netherlands in order to run the business, but he understood that the charitable ventures that attracted his support would only be possible on the basis of a business that was well run and controlled by the family. Like Polly, Oscar sought to serve both the world and the Jewish people. However, Oscar's orientation was to more practical projects, whether as philanthropy or as venture capital. It was his fervent desire to benefit the emerging state of Israel, and hence he initiated several business and philanthropic projects there, which were only loosely tied together. There was indeed an ambivalence in the Van Leer's relation to Israel, but it was neither with respect to Israel's nationalism nor to the young state itself. The Van Leer family clearly felt uncomfortable with certain aspects of the Jewish religion, and especially uncomfortable with the Jewish religion's organized manifestations. But what belief should replace it? Pauli believed that Judaism harbored the kernel of a metaphysical religion of universal wisdom. Hence, she was unhappy with the direction that the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute took under the leadership of Yehuda Elkanah and Oscar Van Leer. They were too oriented to knowledge and not enough to wisdom. In contrast, Oscar Van Leer came increasingly to feel that the Jerusalem Institute should find a purpose in consonance with the direction eventually taken by the then new group foundation, i.e., the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute should devote attention to aspects of the development of creativity in childhood. In Oscar's mind, there existed a link between innovation in science and business and the development of creativity in childhood. He understood well what innovation meant in a business context, and he believed that the economic salvation and survival of Israel could be ensured by investing in Israeli business innovation. Hence, he furthered the germination of what would now be called a high-tech sector. Oscar also argued that such a high-tech incubator had to be located next to a university, specifically in the case of his company next to the Weizmann Institute in Rehovot. Although the return on his Israeli investments was not high, Oscar persevered in investing in Israeli business. The direction of the Van Leer's interests in Israel corresponded more to Oscar's spirit than either the Bernard Van Leer Foundation or the Royal Van Leer packaging industry. The packaging industry management was troubled, both by the drain of money flowing to the foundations and by the specific involvement in Israel. Moreover, the majority of the governing board of the Bernard Van Leer Foundation wanted the Bernard Van Leer Foundation to be a grant-making foundation and not to risk being an operating foundation. In contrast, Oscar always felt that the global Bernard Van Leer Foundation should also be an operating foundation. In that sense, his Israeli ventures were more in consonance with his spirit. As for both the Israeli ventures and the Bernard Van Leer Foundation, one of Oscar's central tenets was, to quote, the integration of the practices and beliefs of the private sector with those of the social sector. That's a quote from him. One could imagine that he would have looked favorably on initiatives in what is today called social entrepreneurship. In the course of the evolution of Van Leer's philanthropic interests, two strands can be discerned. On the one hand, the idea that people's lives can be improved according to a model of development, whether from childhood to adulthood or through cultural improvement. And on the other hand, the visceral commitment to the singular history of the Jewish people, punctuated as it was by discontinuities and crises in the 20th century. For example, Oscar financed the advertisement that called upon the Dutch people to show their support for Israel in the 1973 war. He followed up by establishing a Council for Economic Liaison Europe-Israel and the Jerusalem Group for National Planning, which he organized vis-à-vis the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute. Clearly, Oscar's idea was to promote the convergence between Europe and Israel. In that spirit, Oscar filled several different functions in Israel. For example, he served on the governing board of the Kibbutz Industries Association. As can be imagined, Oscar's increasing interest in Israel led to tensions in the governing board, some of whose members were, as could be expected, wary of the Arab boycott. Oscar was also worried about the fact that the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute pursued goals that were not those of the Bernard Van Leer Foundation. This diversity of purpose between the two main charitable arms of the Van Leer entity opened the door to criticism by the Van Leer Group Foundation, Bernard Van Leer Foundation Board. Oscar's solution was to provide funding for 5 fellowships at the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute for senior scholars in the field of education and parenting. In this way, he felt that he was also pursuing one of Pauli's aims, namely to set up a research center for youth issues in Israel. This project was eventually abandoned for 2 reasons. One, not many senior scholars in this field wanted to spend an entire year in Israel. Any such international program, as Pauli has found out, depends on the willingness of the leading people in the field to spend extended periods both away from their home institutions and then to decide to spend that valuable time in Israel. Not only is such a program very expensive, it can be questioned whether such a program is the best way of furthering intellectual exchange in the Israeli context. The second reason that this program failed was that Oscar's vision of exchange between the 5 senior fellows and the Van Leer Group Foundation Council of 9 did not take place as he wished. In the event, Oscar did recruit luminaries such as Jerome Bruner and Asa Briggs for the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute board. At the same time, Oscar began to increase the Van Leer Group Foundation's contribution to the Cinematheque, i.e. the Jerusalem Film Center. Once again, this contribution led to friction between Oscar and the other trustees. The trustees were ambivalent not only about the targets of Oscar's charitable intentions, but also about the sheer variety and lack of focus of the charitable funding. They directed their fire especially at the contribution of Keren Yaldenu, remember that's the group that stops missionaries, and to other causes such as the Israel Action Collective and the Center for Information and Documentation on Israel. Specifically, the board thought that a global upper limit should be set on the amounts provided for activities in Israel. In this regard, the major question was whether the Van Leer Group Foundation would continue its support of the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute once Oscar would no longer be there. Oscar considered responding to this challenge from within by revising the statutes of the Van Leer Group Foundation so that promoting the well-being of the State of Israel would become a specific goal of the foundation. What was always stopping him was the Arab boycott, which could negatively affect the business. It was for this reason that he carefully chose his language when he wrote his credo, in which he articulated the indissolubility of the connection between the foundation and Israel. I'm going to quote, I think it is worth to quote this one paragraph of the credo, which some of you may have read, in full. And this is in his syntax, and his syntax is his syntax. Okay, one of the convictions which, when still in its adolescence, became part of my heritage, and which thereafter has grown to full maturity, is that if our establishment of enterprise and foundation ever forgot its Jewish origin and thereby failed to contribute within the constraints of its own enlightened self-interest and of its statutes, whatever it could, through all it is, to the establishment, protection, survival, and well-being of a national home for the Jewish people in the land which is now Israel, give or take some of the territory beyond what were its borders at birth, its right hand may as well lose its cunning. And this conviction is separable from its counterpart, which supports that supporting a Jewish homeland for the Jews does not at all imply being anti-Arab, except in self-defense. This gives the background for the 5th building block of my credo. Those who in the future will have the final word in the governance of our affairs are to be profoundly dedicated to the proposition that the established and by now traditional bonds between our company Cum Foundation and the Jewish national home are an integral part of that which is to remain invariant about us. That's the end of the quote. He was not satisfied with pursuing what is the worst curse possible in Judaism on those of successors who would fail to maintain the link with the Jewish national home. He also made his position clear that the goal of providing a safe, sound, and just homeland for the Jewish people should be advanced even if it would harm other interests of the foundation. The Council of 9, which is the group foundation board, voted to accept the credo with a provision that the company need not feel hampered by some of the statements with regard to the implied attitude of the group to Israel. The implication was that this aspect of the credo should be especially valid for the foundation more than for the business. As can be imagined, some of the business management was less than enthusiastic about such outspoken support for Israel. For this reason, Oscar decided to create a business company in Israel which, and this is what he wrote, would eventually fund the charitable activity in that country. That was the original aim of the foundation of Crecor, the name of which is a contraction of Credo Corporation. In this way, Oscar hoped to preserve what had been a given for Bernard, the support of the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute, and the cinematic activities that would eventually become the Jerusalem Film Center. If one contemplates the charitable activity of the family taken as a whole, one can observe that both Polly and Oscar constantly sought to bring together academic groups to ponder social issues. Oscar pursued this idea of feeding the dialogue between science and society in both his charitable activities and his business activities. In that spirit, he was willing to accept a position on the governing board of the Weizmann Institute. In the same sense of forging continuity between academics and society, between universal goals and the support of Jewish nationhood, Oscar also brought into the group foundation people drawn from Israel's security establishments, such as Shalhevet Freyer and Pinchas Sussman. The opening to a wider society meant including the policy elite, and there was no sense that the security component of the policy elite should be kept at a distance. More than most, and in distinction to his mother, Oscar was conscious of the effect of technology on our physical and cultural environments. Oscar's particular genius was the marriage of a technological worldview and a concern for humanitarian conditions in a technological context. Thus, for example, he proposed that El Al Israel Airlines should sacrifice a few rows in the front to create a children's play area. He also proposed the establishment of an Israeli ministry for children's affairs, adjustable seating in movie theaters so that children could see over the heads of adults, and a special children's office in each Israeli embassy. His idea was that Israel should become the most child-friendly country in the world. Once again, we observe the constant theme that Van Leer should invest in Israel, so for what purpose? So that the particular state of Israel would become a universal example to the nations of the world. In the final years of his life, Oscar Van Leer devoted almost all his time and attention to Israel. He encouraged Israeli-Palestinian dialogue from a quite particular angle. Namely, he viewed the purpose of Van Leer's Israeli involvement as being to ensure that Israel was not only an ethnic country of Jews, but a country that would display the best elements of the Jewish tradition. In that spirit, Oscar thought that global innovations and changes would first emerge in Israel. Despite his apparently greater realism when compared to his mother, his commitment to Israel was a kind of substitute religion. As someone who was very conscious of not having been murdered in the Holocaust, Oscar thought that his best legacy would be a vibrant and successful Israel. It was in keeping with this aim that Oscar, for example, contributed his body to science. Now, in conclusion, it may be useful to notice that both Polly's and Oscar's idea of the Jewish tradition, which they valued so highly, was quite different from the way in which normative Orthodox Judaism understands the Jewish tradition. The functionally more universalistic Oscar understood Jewish tradition as signifying a repository of Enlightenment values. Polly was more sophisticated on this issue. She thought that we should look in the Jewish tradition for what we can extract for the furtherance of universalistic values. The idea that modern Israel should represent a fusion of particularistic and universalistic values was a hallmark of the first generations of Zionism. Theodor Herzl, Echad Ha'am, and Chaim Weizmann were all in agreement on this point, although they all had different ideas about which particular values and which universal values to pursue. We also receive relatively little enlightenment on this point from the written records of Polly Van Leer and of Oscar Van Leer. However, it is safe to say that in the context of Israel as it exists today, with its emphasis on particularistic values, they would have desired that their monies be spent on the diffusion of universalistic values, not with the desire to deny the particular, but with the aim of continuing the never-ending dialogue between the universal and the particular. Polly Van Leer's idea of the Jewish tradition was as much directed against Israeli particularism as it was against an ethnically apathetic world, one for which the murder of a people was a matter of relative indifference. We who represent their aims in Israel must strive to ensure that Israeli society not grow complacent in its self-referentiality. It is not our aim to embrace a night in which all cows are black, as Hegel put it, i.e. a global identity, but we need to preserve the delicate balance between being situated in a particular time and place and being concerned for the long-term future of humankind. Thank you. Their enterprises were sold, and I think it was 1999. The direction that came from the business world came to the idea that Van Leer was perhaps, I don't know, but my interpretation is they thought that Van Leer was not perhaps big enough to compete in the mega world of shipping and containers and all the rest, and a good offer came along. They sold it to a Finnish company, which immediately destroyed the business, but they had secured their money in foundation, and for the first 10 years after that, and that is important for another history of Van Leer, the foundation was run by the same people who had run the business. And that gave the foundation a particular tinge and color, which had all kinds of complex relations. It both meant that they had the acumen of business people, but that they also thought about situations like business people do. And as we all know, there are other considerations than those in the world. So I'm not going to get into an evaluation of that period, but I'm just going to say that I think it was, in that sense, a unique period between 1999 and 2008 or 2009 or 2010, because the foundation was being run by people who themselves came from the world of entrepreneurship and management. That actually, I think, made it almost more interesting as viewed from the outside.
Thank you. Other questions?
I'm sure there are, yes.
How was the foundation fed by the company? Was it a percentage of profits?
Well, there are people who know much more about this than I do, who are in the audience, but my impression was that they got a certain percentage of the profits of the company, because the company always, you see, this was the tension. The company wanted to take all the money and reinvest it in the company. And they had to, but they had to regard the foundation as sort of as if you're a public company, you have to pay dividends. So the only question is, was, and I can't answer that, were the subsidies of the foundation greater than the dividends they would have paid if they were a public company or not? Now, once the businesses were sold, the foundation, of course, experienced an immediate rise in its income because suddenly they had all this pot of money and they used it for charitable activities. So they could double and triple, I would imagine, what they were paying before. I don't know the exact proportions. That's something that, because I haven't researched that for this talk. I want to comment on that, and I don't know if you're going to like what I'm going to say, but I'm going to say this, that I think that as I began to think about it, I'll sum up what I said in 2 words. I think the Van Leer family was profoundly affected by World War II and the Holocaust, and was profoundly affected because it changed their idea of what it meant to be a Jew. And they went from a religious definition to an ethnic definition. Now, at the same time, they kept universal and cosmopolitan values. And so they thought, how do we combine the particular state of Israel with universal and particular values? And that's why they were interested in promoting those measures that would make Israel modern technologically, but also modern in terms of values. So they were interested in promoting what we would call loosely Enlightenment values in the context of Israel. It's very clear that that's something on which, if you boil down what Pauly said on the one side and what Oscar said on the other and ask what's in common between them, that's what's in common. They share that view. They would not have thought they shared that view because they used very different vocabularies. But if you read, I went through their texts. I didn't go to the archives for this talk, but I went through all I could get my hands on of what they'd written. And when you boil it down, the same message appears in both places. Now, why is this message so important? Because they are deeply skeptical about the survival of Jews in the diaspora. And they're deeply skeptical about that. That's really clear. And because they're deeply skeptical about that, they want to preserve the universal values in Israel. And it's that particular combination that they're looking for. Now, I think it's a magnificent idea. Is it realistic? Time will tell. In other words, our big issue is this. Is the state of Israel going to become an ethnically particularistic, blinkered state with no sense of the Enlightenment behind it? Or is the state of Israel going to live up to maximal values? To live up, not down, and not to minimal values in all spheres, and not just technology. In other words, and we try, I think, to work for that particular set of values. I view that as the mission that we have. Now, that means that sometimes we're critical of the establishment. It means many other things. But we can never waver, and this is why I personally am a Zionist, on the idea that this has to be accomplished there and not in Sweden or something. In other words, that this is that's what it means for me, is the merger of universal particular. Now, I think this is an issue that affects every modern culture, not just Israel. We all face the fact of, do we have one global identity, the shared human value by which the Chinese, the Portuguese, and the Americans are one? And I think there's a lot to say for that. And the fact that people speak Chinese and Portuguese and English, and they don't have one identity. And they live in very different worlds, and you have to respect their particularism. That's why we had postmodernism and multiculturalism and everything else. But we have to always the balance, because it's an unstable balance. People are always yelling, think of Geert Wilders in your country, of their own ethnic particularism. And people on the other side are always saying, no, we need to have global identity. And the truth is, you have to balance those, because you cannot have either one or the other. You have to find the correct kind of balance. And the point is, you have to know that history is working in such a way that the correct balance is constantly changing. In other words, that you can't say, oh, we found the solution today and it's good for tomorrow. It's not. And that's something that you have to face as you diagnose the problems of the society in which you live. That's why the social involvement is important, because it's not because I'm not that socially concerned, but what I've learned is that society is telling me something I can't get from the archives, that I have to listen very closely to what society tells me so that I can calibrate what we do in terms of what society is telling me about where it is. And one of the things that happens to me, and this is off the topic, but I'll say this, is sometimes I get together with Israeli oligarchs. These are prominent people. And one of the things that never ceases to amaze me, because they remind me of American oligarchs. And why? Because like all oligarchs, they are out of touch. They are out of touch because all oligarchs live in a self-congratulatory world of the alliance of the successful, where they only see other successful people. You cannot deduce the situation of society from the successful people in it by obvious nature. So you have to pay attention to the failures. And you have to pay attention to the people who think that they're not successful for the social side of a society. And if you do that, that doesn't mean you'll have to pay attention only to them, but you have to read society not as somebody you're going to help, but somebody who's teaching you how to think about it. It's a text. And if you think about how they're teaching you how to think about it, then I think you can think, well, here I am. I come from 19th and 20th century German philosophy. How can I recode what I have to say, if anything, in terms of what that society needs? You see, as I've diagnosed it. And that's the important interface. Because the whole idea, this is something that Yehuda Elkanah, was the first director of the Institute, did. He took all kinds of famous people, and he would send them to a school in the Negev somewhere. And he'd just say after a day, he'd ask them, well, what did you learn? Because he said, and I said, well, why didn't you take experts? He said, because you take a highly intelligent person in something, you put him out in a school for a day, and he listens, you're going to learn something from him. You're going to learn something from him. And I think that's a very true message. I find that you can take people from the weirdest fields. Medieval Persian rhetoric. Ever heard of that one? And, and we have somebody who's working on that, and you take them and you put them in the context of a socially involved institute, and hey, presto, a year later they're socially involved. And they bring their tremendous intelligence to bear on the social problems. So it's our job not just to take people who are socially involved or social activists. It's our job to take people who are not social activists and turn them into social activists. And that's the point of that one. Because some of the most intelligent people, I can tell you this from my previous job as dean, are in Sumerian studies. There's a pull of highly intelligent people to the most exotic fields. And because there's a pull all the time of that, you have to think then about and you can't just walk up to them and say, what's your social responsibility? So here again, it's the universal and the particular. You say Israeli society, Sumerian studies? There are 20 people in the world who know that field. That's it. And you want them in both. You want both Sumerian studies and social involvement. So that's my answer. It's very long, I'm sorry, to that question.
Thank you. Any other questions?
I'm sure there must be. Well, the answer is, in brief, it's a big, broad mission, but I'll say this, that the foundation was not set up. You see, for instance, the oldest organization is the one that I represent, the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute. But at some point, and the original foundation was not sure of what it wanted to do. And Oscar happened to meet somebody who was into children and development in the United States. And he discerned through this conversation with this guy that there was a market opening in this field, that this was something where not a lot of foundations were at the time, and they could enter into it. And so then he redirected what became the Bernard Van Leer Foundation and into a foundation focused on children. This happened, I believe, in the 1960s or something like that. And at that point, that second foundation came to be. And then, of course, once you had two foundations, and then a third, the question was, what was the relation between them? And then you had Craig or two. And, and what the relation between of all these is an issue which is constantly being debated within the institutions of the foundation, because it's also unstable. And it's unstable by its definition. It should be unstable. And in other words, that's what I'm trying to say. Controlled instability is nothing bad. It means that you cannot settle issues once and for all, but that you're willing to say, no, I'm going to put more money here, I'm going to put more money there, depending on where you think the market opportunity is. Because sometimes it's in children in Nigeria, and sometimes it's in Sumerian in Tel Aviv, and you don't know. And I actually believe this. People ask me, why don't you focus your institute more? And I say, I'm not interested in focusing more. I'm interested in maximum diversification, because I don't know where the next great breakthrough or idea, even in social innovation, is going to come from. And so I'm interested in doing this as a venture capital firm where we do lots of things with the idea that most of it fails. Every year we make a call for proposals, and every year there's a committee that meets and evaluates all the work we're doing.
I mean reevaluating yourself, your own organization.
We have a structure. We have a structure by which we evaluate. I initiated last year a structure by which we have external committees evaluating parts, because I don't think you can evaluate the whole. So we started with Judaism, and this year we have a committee evaluating our education program, which is an external committee, trying to look at its different aspects and deciding whether we're doing anything that's worthwhile. And I started with those units because I had certain questions in mind. But I eventually hope that in 5 or 6 years we can evaluate all the different parts of the Institute, and to make sure what they are and what we can learn. Because an evaluation, you have to know, is not just that you're going to close something down. It's something contrary. You want, from the evaluation, you want it to be an exchange between the evaluating committee and the valuees, so that both sides learn from it, and so that maybe the people who are employed can start reconceiving their enterprise in that way. That's maybe a vain hope, but that's what I really hope will happen on that. I think that in the Jewish department it did happen. There was a reconceptualization that did occur.